Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really getting into Karl Marx's Das Kapital, our mission, to sort of pull out the key ideas, the important observations, maybe some surprising bits too, giving you a shortcut, if you like, to understanding early capitalism, its impact, and maybe some facts you haven't come across.
That's right. And it's important to say this isn't just, dry theory. It's packed with historical research. It really tries to show what life was like for workers during the Industrial Revolution. We'll look at how Marx, with quite remarkable detail and even self-criticism, according to the text, how he dug into concepts like value, labor, capital, revealing all these tensions under the surface of, what was called progress. And you'll see how a lot of these discussions are still pretty relevant today.
Yeah, you've set that up perfectly. What seems really striking about Das Kapital isn't just the theory, but Marx's own dedication, his commitment to getting it right.
It really is quite extraordinary. After Volume 1 came out in 1867, he just kept working relentlessly on the next ones. The source mentions his extraordinary scientific accuracy and painful conscientiousness, and severe self-criticism. He was always doing more research, trying to perfect it, even though he was apparently dealing with poor health and his work with the International Workingmen's Association.
Wow.
Yeah. And because of this, Friedrich Engels' role became absolutely crucial after Marx died. Engels prepared and published Volume 2, that was 1885, and Volume 3 in 1894. He also edited the English translation of the first volume, 1887 that was, and oversaw later German editions too.
Yeah. So Engels really carried it forward.
He really did, and the impact was pretty immediate. By 1894, Volume 1 was already translated into French, Spanish, Danish, Polish, Italian, Dutch. It spread quickly.
And the book itself, it kind of warns you, doesn't it? Right at the start, it says something like, all beginnings are hard in every science, and that the first chapter, the one analyzing the commodity, that's the real challenge.
Exactly. It uses that interesting metaphor. Studying a single body cell is harder than looking at the whole body. Because with the economic forms, you don't have microscopes or chemical tests. You need, as the text puts it, the power of abstraction instead.
Okay, so why is that first chapter, the commodity, so vital then?
Well, the text argues that the commodity form, or the value form of the commodity, that's the economic cell form of bourgeois society. It's like the basic DNA of the whole capitalist system he's describing. Understand that, and you're on your way to understanding the bigger picture.
Got it. The fundamental unit. So let's break down this cell. Marx points out its dual nature, right?
Yeah.
Use value and value.
Use value is just its usefulness. Does it satisfy a need? Like air or a meadow, they're useful, but have no value in this sense because no human labor produced them. And if you make something just for yourself, like baking your own bread to eat, that's use value, but it's not a commodity.
Okay, so to be a commodity, it needs usefulness and something else.
Yes, it needs value, which the text defines as the human labor embodied in it. And crucially, it has to be produced for others, for social use, and then transferred through exchange. That's when it becomes a commodity.
And the amount of value that comes down to labor time.
Exactly. Labor is the substance of value, and labor time is its measure. So the value of something changes based on how much labor goes in and also how productive that labor is. More productive labor means less value per item, even if it's just as useful.
Okay, so we have commodities embodying labor time as value. How does money fit into this? The text calls it a riddle.
Yeah, but it suggests the riddle disappears if you trace how money develops. It starts simple. Use an example. Linen expressing its value in a coat. The coat becomes the equivalent form. It means the coat can be directly exchanged for the linen. The amount they exchange for depends on the labor time in each, not just the fact that the coat is acting as the equivalent. Money is just the universal version of that coat, the universal equivalent.
Ah, okay. And this is where Aristotle apparently hit a wall.
That's what the text suggests. Aristotle saw that exchange implied some kind of equality, but he couldn't figure out the common substance between, say, a house and a bed. He apparently said such a common substance cannot exist in truth. But Marx identifies that substance as abstract human labor.
That's quite a leap, and it leads to this idea of exchange as a social hieroglyph.
Yes, it's a fascinating point. When people exchange different products as values, they are, without necessarily realizing it, equating the different types of labor that went into them as simply equal human labor. The act of exchange itself creates this social equation. The product becomes a kind of code, a social hieroglyph, and we later try to figure out what it means.
Okay, that sets up the idea of circulation. The text talks about two main cycles, WGW and GWG.
Right. WGW is commodity, money, commodity. You start with a commodity, sell it for money, then use that money to buy another commodity you need, like sell linen, W, get money, G, buy a Bible, W. The goal is the final commodity, the use value, consumption.
Simple enough. Sell something to buy something else. But then there's GWG, money, commodity money. This sounds circular.
Yeah.
Why exchange money just to get money back?
But that's the key difference. It's not about getting the same money back.
Yeah.
The whole point of GWG is that the money you end up with, G prime, is more than the money you started with. There's an increment, a difference, G. And that increment is what Marx calls surplus value.
So it's not just GWG, it's GWG with an increase.
Exactly. And this movement, this cycle aimed at increasing the initial sum, is what transforms mere money into capital.
Yeah.
The driving force isn't consumption anymore. It's the self-expansion of value, valorization. It's inherently endless. Hence that quote, accumulate, accumulate. That is Moses and the prophets.
That's a powerful image. So where does this extra bit, this surplus value, actually come from? The text says it's not just from marking up prices, right?
Right. Not simply by selling things for more than they're worth in this framework.
Uh-huh.
The crucial step, according to the analysis, is that the capitalist finds a unique commodity on the market. Labor power.
Labor power as a commodity. How does that work?
There are specific conditions. The owner of the labor power, the worker, must be free in a double sense. Free to sell their ability to work to whomever they choose, but also free from owning the means of production, so they have to sell their labor power to survive. And importantly, they sell it for a limited time. If they sold it permanently, they'd be a slave, not a free commodity owner. So the exchange happens, on the surface, between equals buyer and seller of a commodity.
Okay, so the capitalist buys labor power, and the capitalist is described as personified capital. Their whole drive is to create surplus value.
That's the idea presented. The life drive is valorization, absorbing the greatest possible mass of surplus labor from the workers using the means of production, constant capital. And this relentless drive leads directly to the struggle over the length of the working day.
Right, the battleground. The text brings up that last hour fallacy. What was that about?
Yeah, that was a theory, apparently popularized by an economist named Nassau Sr. He argued that all the profit was made in the final hour of work. The text just demolishes this, saying it's all bosh.
Aha, all bosh. Love it.
It argues surplus value, the unpaid labor, is generated throughout the working day, not just crammed into the end.
So the working day becomes this tug of war. There are physical limits needing food, rest, sleep, and maybe social or moral limits too.
Yes, the text mentions needing time for education, social life, etc., but it also notes these limits are very elastic, which is why you saw working days historically ranging massively from maybe 8 hours right up to 18 hours, or even more in some cases described.
And the pushback against that elasticity led to things like the Factory Acts.
Exactly. The Factory Act of 1833 is mentioned, regulating hours for children and young people in certain industries, setting a 15-hour window they could work within, and mandating meal breaks. But almost immediately, factory owners found ways around it, like the relay system, constantly changing shift to make enforcement incredibly difficult.
So the law gets passed, but the struggle continues on the ground.
Absolutely. The text emphasizes the role of worker agitation, things like the 10 hours bill movement, Chartism. And interestingly, even some factory owners who did comply pushed for better enforcement because they faced what they called immoral competition from those who didn't.
That makes sense. Competition drives exploitation downward sometimes.
Right. So you get the Act of 1844, which tried to fix loopholes, establishing fixed start and end times, uniform meal breaks. This effectively extended the regulated day to adult men, too, because their work was often dependent on the children and young people covered by the act.
But resistance didn't stop there.
Not at all. The text mentions things like inspectors in Scotland allowing illegal relay systems, factory owners acting as magistrates and acquitting themselves, and direct action, like the hand mule spinners sending a formal notice to employers refusing to work more than 60 hours, protesting their hilot, or slave-like status.
It paints a really conflict-ridden picture, and then the text dives into industries without much regulation. And it gets pretty dark, doesn't it?
It really does. The examples are stark. Lace making. Kids as young as 9 or 10 dragged out of bed at 2 or 3 a.m. to work until 10 or 11 at night, just for basic subsistence.
Brutal.
Then there's pottery in Staffordshire. Official reports described a degenerated population, workers often dwarfish, ill-formed, suffering lung diseases, doctors noting generations getting weaker. Children's health, sacrificed to indulge the greed of their parents and employers.
Parents, too. That's grim.
Yeah, the economic pressures were immense. Baking involved night work, incredibly long hours often followed by delivery routes in intense heat. Millinery dressmaking had that famous case of Mary Ann Walkley in 1863, dying from simple overwork, averaging 16.5 hours a day. The text notes how English papers used this to counter criticism of American slavery, pointing to their own wage labor conditions.
Wow, whataboutism even then, and other industries?
Iron and steel had 24-hour relay systems, boys treated as mere substitutes for steam power. Glasswork saw kids walking huge distances during 14, 15-hour shifts. Brickmaking was linked to great moral degradation, terrible conditions, kids growing up lawless, depraved. Even straw plating involved tiny children working incredibly long hours.
It's hard to even imagine, and this connects to that trade in human flesh you mentioned earlier.
Yes, the text describes how poor law commissioners would facilitate shipping agricultural laborers, often paupers, to factory districts, sometimes literally labeled like parcels. It became a business, agents buying and selling people to manufacturers, compared explicitly to the slave trade in the American South.
Just, wow. And all this led to a noticeable degeneration of the population in industrial areas.
That's the argument, that the system was literally using people up and could only sustain itself by constantly drawing in healthier labor from rural areas or through migration.
Which brings us back to that core contradiction Marx highlights. Massive wealth creation alongside deepening poverty. Gladstone's quote really nails that, doesn't it?
It does. That quote from the 1860s, intoxicating augmentation of wealth and power for the rich, while for most, life remains a mere struggle for existence. The text argues this wasn't accidental, but inherent to the process of capitalist accumulation as it was developing.
And this struggle showed up in things like pauperism and actual starvation.
Yes. Pauperism figures were often downplayed, the text suggests, especially as class conflict grew. Rising starvation deaths in London were seen as evidence of people preferring death to the workhouse slavery, the terrible conditions and institutions for the poor. There was even a government report by Dr. Smith finding many workers simply weren't getting enough food to avoid starvation diseases.
And housing, another crisis zone?
Absolutely. As production centralized, workers crammed into awful housing. City improvements, like building banks or wider streets, often just pushed the poor into even worse, more crowded slums. Speculators made fortunes from this misery. Conditions in parts of London and Newcastle were described in reports as hellish. Landlords sometimes controlled housing so tightly, miners couldn't even find alternatives, knowing bad housing wouldn't be enough to trigger a strike if jobs were scarce.
So the progress in industry and science didn't lift all boats.
Quite the opposite, according to this analysis. It mainly led to an increase in the luxury and enjoyment of the idle rich, while the conditions for those doing the work often deteriorated or stagnated at a very low level.
Okay, so the length of the working day was one major battleground. But Marx also looked at how workers were paid, didn't he? Like the piece wage system.
He did. Piece wages getting paid per item produced weren't new, but became much more common during the manufacturing period. The text argues it was a really effective tool for capitalists. It seems fair, linking pay to output, but it could be used to intensify work, push down the rate per piece, and extend hours. He gives the example of weavers whose piece rates fell so much they earned less per day, even working longer hours.
So it incentivizes workers to work harder and longer just to maintain their income while the rate per piece can be cut.
Exactly. And it also made things like the subletting of labor easier. You get middlemen hiring workers on piece rates and pocketing the difference between what the main capitalist pays and what the worker actually gets.
Sneaky. And what about machinery? We think of it as increasing efficiency, but the text presents it almost as a weapon.
Sometimes explicitly so. There are quotes about machinery being introduced specifically to break strikes, to reestablish order, to force the rebellious hand of labor into obedience. New carpet looms, for instance, let manufacturers cut piece rates drastically, so workers produce way more just to earn the same wage as before.
So technology wasn't neutral in this conflict.
Not at all, in this view. Plus, owners use all sorts of deductions fines for supposed flaws, even if the materials or machines were bad, deductions for rent on company housing, all chipping away at the actual take-home pay.
And did Marx compare Britain to other countries?
Yes, using data from factory inspectors like Redgrave. It showed, for example, British workers operated more spindles on average than continental workers.
Mm-hmm.
But the key point wasn't just the nominal wage, but the relative price of labor, the labor cost per unit of output. This was often lower in Britain despite higher intensity, meaning more value extracted per worker.
Okay, one last really striking area, this systematic colonization theory. It sounds quite deliberate.
Oh, it was presented as a very deliberate strategy by Edward Gibbon Wakefield. He saw a problem in colonies like Australia or Canada. The problem, the anti-capitalist cancer, as he apparently called it, was that land was cheap and plentiful. Immigrants could quickly save up, buy land, and become independent farmers or artisans.
And why was that a problem for capitalists?
Because it meant there wasn't a reliable pool of people forced to work for wages. Capital needs wage labor to expand. So Wakefield's solution, his systematic colonization, was simple. Artificially raise the price of land. Make it really expensive.
So immigrants couldn't afford it right away.
Exactly. They'd be forced to work for wages for years, saving up. And the money raised from selling this overpriced land, use it to bring more poor immigrants, more have-nots, from Europe to the colony, ensuring a constant supply of wage workers for the capitalists already there.
Wow. That's quite a system, engineering a workforce.
It's presented as a conscious mechanism to make sure immigrants created capital for employers before they could become independent. A way to guarantee wage dependency even in places with abundant resources.
Okay, let's try and wrap our heads around this. We've covered a huge amount from Das Kapital, not just the abstract stuff like value theory, but these really vivid, often disturbing accounts of early industrial capitalism as Marx documented it.
Yeah, what really stands out is how the text connects the dots. From that relentless drive for surplus value, the werewolf hunger, as it's sometimes called, right through to the specific techniques used, whether it's manipulating the working day, using piece wages, or even engineering labor markets through colonization. It highlights this fundamental tension, this conflict between the drive to accumulate capital and the human consequences of that drive.
So for you listening, what's the takeaway here? I think this deep dive really shows how concepts we might think of as purely economic value, capital, wages, have incredibly real, tangible, and sometimes dramatic effects on people's lives. It definitely challenges you to look past the surface.
And maybe to think about that initial point. If the commodity really is the economic cell form of society, how does understanding its complexities, the way Marx breaks it down in this text, help you maybe look critically at the economic structures around us today, and perhaps question what we mean by progress and who actually benefits from it? It leaves you with some big questions.